Steady growth in the pre-Christmas economy, but fears for the future. The economy expanded 0.6% in the last 3 months of 2016, but the future depends in part on how we leave the EU.
Is very good news for Britain, a very strong signal of the strong prospects that we have for the future.
Also this lunchtime, May heads for historic talks with Trump. She says they can lead the world but won't fight shy on torture or women's rights. The banks clash with cash point providers over charges. It could cost us more to access our money. And the sole surviving Dambuster, and the public calls to make him a knight.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Alistair Stewart.
Good afternoon. Further evidence today the sky did not fall in on the UK economy in the wake of the Brexit vote. Indeed, it grew a further 0.6% in the last 3 months of 2016. The high street hummed, travel did well, as did farming. But, and it's a big but, much of the future hinges on the deal the government gets with the European Union. The Chancellor tells us he's confident, and the bill to start the process was published in the last hour. Our political correspondent Paul Brand on the health of the UK economy.
He said it.
The shock to our economy after leaving Europe would tip the country into recession.
She said it.
It's going to be pretty bad to very, very bad.
And even Mr Hammond said it too.
The short-term shocks of a vote to leave on June 23rd will hit this economy hard.
But 7 months on, in his new role, he's got a new tone, as figures out today show our economy's still growing, despite Brexit.
Well, very pleased with the figures that have been announced this morning, showing yet again that the UK economy is resilient and that the expectations that many people have expressed of a slowdown have yet to come to pass.
In fact, Britain's GDP grew by 0.6% in the final quarter of 2016, partly driven by a 0.8% boost to the service sector, adding up to 2% growth over the whole of last year, only slightly behind the 2.2% in 2015. Leaving Brexiteers particularly pleased, partly with themselves.
I don't think that people really believed the warnings given by the Remain campaign that somehow our economy would head off a cliff if people voted to leave. It clearly hasn't happened.
In fact, more figures out today show car manufacturing has hit a 17-year high. But since the referendum, the shopping in the boot is getting more expensive thanks to inflation, and many warn the full effects of Brexit are yet to come, with some putting investment on hold, though not here at Jaguar Land Rover.
We're aware of all the likely scenarios and we continually scenario plan. But the important thing is we're steadfast and we have not changed. We're optimistic about the future, not pessimistic.
So for all the arguments constructed during the campaign, so far what the British economy's actually produced isn't quite as bad as some predicted. Paul Brand, ITV News, Westminster.
And our business editor Joel Hills joins us live now from the Jaguar Land Rover plant in Solihull that you just saw there in Paul's report. Joel, so the car industry very positive at the moment. What's the basis for their optimism for the future?
Well, it wasn't very positive before the referendum, was it, Alistair? Let's remind ourselves of that. And yet the number of cars rolling off production lines around Britain is heading towards record levels, and no one builds more cars than Jaguar Land Rover. It's got its tail up, as you heard just there. But note two things. First of all, most of the parts that British car makers use for their cars are imported. The fall in the value of the pound, therefore, is actually having a negative effect on their finances. And also note that investment by car companies in Britain actually fell sharply last year. Some are clearly sitting on their hands and waiting to see if the government can get the trade deal it says it can.
Are we any clearer in your mind why so many of those pre-Brexit warnings that were so dire are so wide of the mark?
Yes, I think we are. Look, the assumption here was that in the event of Brexit, people, consumers, businesses would sit on their hands, spending would dry up, investment would too, and the economy would falter. What's actually happened is that consumers, in particular, have merrily spent their way through all that uncertainty in a way that no one really expected. The short-term forecasts, Alistair, have been proved hopelessly wrong, but the longer-term analysis, the longer-term predictions, the importance of the trade deal, they cannot be dismissed quite so easily. The pound has fallen, prices are rising, and the wide expectation is the economy will slow. There's just no way of knowing by how much.
Joel, thanks very much. Well, crucial to the future of Britain's economy is the deal, as I said at the very beginning of this programme, that we eventually strike with the European Union when we leave. And today MPs got to see a brief first draft of the bill that will eventually give permission to the Prime Minister to trigger Article 50. Well, our political correspondent Carl Dinnan now joins me live from Westminster this lunchtime. Short and sharp, what's in it?
Not a lot, just 2 clauses. This is it. This is all of it. 132 words. This is what all the fuss was about. All those court cases, the Supreme Court telling Parliament, telling the Prime Minister that Parliament had to give her the power to trigger Article 50, which starts our process of leaving the EU. So this just says it confers power from Parliament onto the Prime Minister to trigger that Article 50. It's very short. The government wants to fast track it, to zip it through Parliament so that Prime Minister can do that by the end of March, as she said. Now, that has caused some complaints here. Labour MPs in particular are saying the 5 days that they're going to get to debate this just isn't enough, given that once this has gone through and the Article 50 is triggered, that leaving the EU will then become inevitable. It becomes irreversible. Labour, however, have other problems with this. Jeremy Corbyn has said today that he will order his MPs under what's called a 3-line whip to vote in favour of triggering Article 50. That gives some front benchers, including the Shadow Business Secretary Clive Lewis, a problem because they're against it. It could yet cause resignations, more resignations from Labour's front bench.
Carl, thank you. Well, the Prime Minister herself, Theresa May, wasn't in the Commons to hear the Brexit questions today. Instead, she was heading to the airport. She's flying out to Washington to meet Donald Trump. She will become the first world leader to meet with the new American president, and her top priority will be to lay the foundations for a new British-American trade deal once Britain leaves the European Union. But there's plenty more on the agenda, and our Washington correspondent Robert Moore joins us live now from the United States Capitol. So, Robert, what's on her schedule?
Well, she's arriving first of all into Philadelphia, where she will be meeting with Republican Party congressional leaders. And her message there, as it will be here on Friday morning, tomorrow morning, is very simple, that actually a post-Brexit Britain is a perfect partner for the United States. In other words, that if Donald Trump is suspicious of international organizations and multilateral agreements, then fine, we are absolutely in the market, she will argue, for a bilateral trade deal with the United States. And Alistair, plenty of older conservatives in this town are giving us plenty of misty-eyed talk about recreating the Thatcher-Reagan axis. That may be wishful thinking, of course. And then after Philadelphia tonight, Mrs. May will come down here and then tomorrow morning, as I say, be the very first foreign leader into the Trump White House.
And beyond those trade talks, Robert, there's lots in the air that may carry diplomatic dangers.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is a visit that seemed pretty smart before the inauguration, but 6 days on, I think it is looking much more of a sort of perilous diplomatic mission. You know, Donald Trump very clearly emerging as an isolationist, as a protectionist. Last night, very provocatively defending the use of torture. His language is one of Fortress America. Very tricky, that, very problematic for Mrs. May, who is obviously projecting herself as a free trader. She's projecting Britain as a sort of global player, advocating for NATO, suspicious of Russia. So it's no longer quite so clear, Alistair, that racing into the Oval Office is the better strategy. The German Chancellor, for example, in contrast, preferring strategic patience, wanting to wait and see where this administration goes. So it certainly is a mission that looked straightforward, is now looking much more perilous.
Fascinating couple of days ahead. Robert, thank you. Here, the identity of a man found dead on Saddleworth Moor has finally been revealed. 67-year-old David Litton from London was found fully clothed but without identification in December 2015. Police discovered he had died from poisoning, but until now were unable to determine who he was. Royal Bank of Scotland set aside a further £3.1 billion to settle claims from US authorities that it missold risky mortgages in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. The provision means that state-backed RBS is unlikely to make a profit for a 9th year in a row. And a record number of prisoners committed suicide in England and Wales last year. Ministry of Justice figures show 119 inmates killed themselves, meaning the jail suicide rate has doubled since 2012. Assaults on staff and fellow prisoners also increased. Young people with complex learning difficulties are being hidden from society and their families, according to the conclusions of a review into the care system today. The Council for Disabled Children found a serious lack of vision and accountability, despite a number of government initiatives aimed at improving the system. As a result, it says, some children are institutionalised from an early age. Helena Carter reports.
Leo's son Stephen lives miles away from home. He has learning disabilities and autism, but has been kept in a psychiatric unit, his family making the 80-mile journey to see him for what was sometimes only a matter of minutes. It's an ongoing battle for his mum, who thinks he's being institutionalised. She just wants him back.
If it is suggested for your child to go into an institution, I ask you, consider what you're doing. Please try and say no to that. Because once our young people go into these institutions, they're stuck there. They're lost. And that's precisely what happened to Stephen.
NHS England estimates there were more than 800 people under the age of 25 with autism or learning disabilities in inpatient care last year, while more than 1,000 children were in year-round residential schools. The cost of this inpatient care and treatment is around £1 million per child every 3 years. It was the exposure of the abuse of patients at Winterbourne View 6 years ago that prompted change. An end to the institutionalisation of young people, of their isolation and of the distress it causes. But a new report reveals how children and young people with disabilities are still being failed by the system.
It doesn't intervene early. It doesn't recognise their rights as childhood. It doesn't support families to the level that families need. And when children then fail at every level of the system to be supported, they end up in very, very expensive institutional care, and for lots of them we don't understand the way out.
This report, it's hoped, will be a catalyst for change, a chance for new models of care to be provided, a chance for people like Stephen to come home. Helena Carter, ITV News.
Still to come, why thousands of high street cash machines could be under threat, and the call for the last remaining Dambuster to be made a night. But first, the British astronaut Tim Peake has announced today that he plans to take a second trip up to the International Space Station. He became something of a star, spending 186 days in space last year, taking part in hundreds of experiments and still finding time to run a marathon. He made the announcement at the Science Museum in London today, where the capsule that returned him to Earth has just gone on display. From there, our science correspondent Alok Jha reports.
Here's what happens when you fall through the sky at 17,000 miles per hour. This is a Russian Soyuz capsule, its skin burned and torn apart by the Earth's atmosphere. And here's why. After it detached from the International Space Station, the capsule scorched through the skies above Kazakhstan last June, with Major Tim Peake and his crewmates, Yuri Malenchenko and Tim Kopra, inside. They'd been in space for 7 months. This capsule absorbed the ravages of their hair-raising ride home. Today, unveiled at the Science Museum in London, Tim Peake saw his spacecraft again, for the first time since he landed back on Earth.
This is wonderful to see the Soyuz capsule. What a marvellous vehicle it is, and wonderful hybrid of new and old. I think the Russians have this great philosophy of if it ain't broke, then don't fix it. You can see that with the Soyuz. There are elements here that are from the 60s in terms of design, and then there are elements like the glass cockpit that are very modern. This is a very safe, very reliable vehicle.
It's hard to tell, but it feels like a lot of water.
As the first British astronaut in the European Space Agency, Tim Peake always said he wanted to inspire a new generation of scientists and engineers. In his talks and appearances since he landed, it's mission accomplished.
I want to be an astronaut because it would be really fun to go up in a rocket and then come down as a burning ball of fire.
Wouldn't you be scared though?
Yeah, but it'd also be fun.
The European Space Agency announced today that Tim Peake will get another mission to the space station. So he'll get to experience the feeling of being cramped up inside the Soyuz capsule at least a few more times. Alok Jha, ITV News.
The comedian Rory McGrath has avoided jail after admitting harassing a married former lover for over a year. The 6-year-old TV star pleaded guilty at Huntingdon Magistrates Court in Cambridgeshire, where he was given a suspended 10-week sentence. Children living in the UK's most deprived areas are more likely to be in poor health. A landmark report found 1 in 5 children in the first year of primary school were overweight or obese, and it blames an alarming gap between the rich and the poor. And in tennis, Venus Williams has won through to the final of the Australian Open in Melbourne, her first major final in 8 years. It means that she'll face her sister Serena in the final this Saturday, the 9th time they've met each other in a Grand Slam final. Now, the future of tens of thousands of free cash machines up and down the country has come under threat today because of a row between high street banks and the ATM firm that runs them. It's all to do with the charges that the banks have to pay when their customers use those machines. If it's not resolved, well, it could mean that many cash machines would close, or they'll start charging people to use them more. Joining me now is Ron Del Nevo from the industry body that represents ATM providers. Good of you to come in. First of all, we take it for granted with most of them when we stick the card in and out comes the cash. What are the charges that some machines, the ones that you speak for, what are they for?
I speak for them all, because we have banks and independent employers members. So it's not one side against the other, actually, in this case. Several banks run ATMs in the Link network and make money from doing so. But some banks which haven't got enough ATMs out there, many of their customers have to use other ATMs. And of course, the people operating those other ATMs, whether it be banks or independents, have to be paid for the service. Now, the solution is quite simple. If you're a bank and you're unhappy about paying too much interchange, put more ATMs out there, because that way your customers can use your ATMs and you won't have any interchange to pay.
But once the machine's been stuck in, supposing it's at a garage at the end of the country lane that I live in, if I get cash out from there, it costs me a fee, and then the fee between the suppliers is 25p. I mean, a guy turns up and sticks money in it once a week or what have you.
If it costs you as a customer there and then, if you're told it's going to cost you £1.50 or £1.75, then there is no fee between the providers. That is the only fee. But if you get that transaction for nothing, and nearly 98% of transactions in the UK are free, then there is a payment between the providers. So if that had been a Barclays ATM and you used it using your Lloyds card, Barclays would get 25p or so.
And that's the figure that they want to cut themselves so that it's still free when I use it.
In that example, Lloyds would want to see the fee cut. But the point is that that fee's just cost recovery.
Isn't this just a battle of two giants, the ATM providers and the banks, to try and keep their bottom lines going, to maximise their profits?
It's not a battle between all the banks and independent providers. There are only 1 or 2 banks who have raised this issue. The bottom line is that banks operate a lot of those machines which aren't at branches, and they get those fees too. So it isn't a battle line between independent...
I mean, Santander, as you will know, you know better than I do, Santander are very unhappy. Virgin are saying, well, they might go down the road of MasterCard or something.
Yeah, well, Virgin may be big in transport, but they're tiddly in ATMs, so let's not worry about Virgin in this case. As for Santander, well, they have their views, but the reality is, as I say, that the population of Britain use those ATMs, 3 billion cash withdrawals a year. We need to maintain that service for the public of Britain. It's in the public interest, so everybody needs to work together to make sure that happens. And by the way...
Yeah, got to stop it there, only because of time. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Ron, thanks for coming in and explaining that. Finally, it was one of the most audacious attacks of the Second World War in the heartland of Hitler's Germany. Those who carried out the Dambusters raid were true heroes, and many won bravery awards, but none got a knighthood. With just one surviving Dambuster alive, there is a campaign to get him the gong that many say he deserves. Suzanne Verdi reports.
95-year-old George Johnny Johnson admits he's absolutely amazed by the public response, calling for him to be knighted.
I hope to be able to ask, if this comes to anything, to ask, if necessary, Her Majesty, if I may be permitted to dedicate that to the memory of the 55,573 Bomber Command people that gave their lives in the service of their countries.
Johnny, on the left here, volunteered to join the RAF in 1940, eventually becoming a specialist bomb aimer. He was 22 when in 1943, as part of 617 Squadron, he climbed into one of these and took part in some of the most daring raids of the Second World War, firing Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bombs to blow up 3 dams in Germany, in a mission to disable Hitler's industrial heartland. Of 133 airmen on the operation, he was one of just 80 who returned. Fellow RAF veteran John Nichol, who was shot down, captured and tortured during the First Gulf War in 1991, joined Carol Vorderman at number 10 today to hand in a 200,000 signature petition asking the government to honour him.
Just because somebody's not famous, just because somebody is not newsworthy, does not mean that they are not deserving of our nation's highest recognition.
And Johnny too believes an honour would make up for the lack of recognition he and his comrades sometimes felt after the war.
There is so little recognition of that loss of lost life from Bomber Command during the war. I don't know of any other military unit, single unit, that had as many losses.
We will, of course, have to wait to find out if he gets the honour so many want him to have. Suzanne Verdi, ITV News.
We'll let you know. Mary Nightingale will be here at 6:30, but from all of us, good afternoon.